I have two pieces of scripture I want you to hear this morning, both from the prophet Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the trampling warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord will do this. And from Isaiah 25, but here on this mountain the Lord of hosts will throw a feast for all the people of the world, a feast of the finest foods, a feast with vintage wines, a feast of 7 courses, a feast lavish with gourmet desserts. And here on this mountain God will banish the pall of doom hanging over the peoples, the shadow of doom darkening all nations. Yes, he'll banish death forever, and God will wipe the tears from every face. He'll remove every sign of disgrace from his people, wherever they are. Yes, God says so. Also at that time, people will say, look at what's happened. This is our God. We waited for him, and he showed up and saved us. This God, the one we waited for, let's celebrate and sing the joys of his salvation. God's hand rests on this mountain. Let's pray. May the words of my mouth and the words of Brandon's mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In our reading this morning, Isaiah presents God's vision of a mountain where peace and justice reign forever. Feasting on rich food, pure choice wines, death will be destroyed and every tear wiped away. Undoubtedly, we all aspire to such a paradise where all people are united in mutual respect and love. Unfortunately, we live in a much less perfect world. Indeed, tears abound among the poor and the oppressed, even today. Today, on the Sunday of Advent, in which we ordinarily speak of world peace, we're going to look much closer to home. 3 years ago, last September, my cousin Mandy, Lois's sister Susan's daughter, was brutally murdered by her boyfriend in her sleep. A horrible act of domestic violence that, looking back, we saw the patterns and the warnings, but we didn't pay attention to them. And I know that I shouldn't have been silent on this issue before that time. And I definitely know we cannot be silent on this issue now. We've got to talk about real issues happening in a real world. Today, let us reflect on the tears of so many women and men and children who suffer most of the time in secret about devastating abuse in their homes. This is supposed to be a season of peace and good cheer, and there is no doubt that the one we wait on this season, the Christ sent into this world to bring justice and peace, wants us not only to dry those tears, but to help the victims of violence find liberation and find peace from the abuse they suffer. We are called to be messengers of God's peace. We are called to be that messenger for those who endure the torment of violence in their homes and in this world. This is why I'm excited to have Brandon Pasley from the YWCA here with us today. Brandon is the YWCA Senior Director of Specialized Training. And I want to thank you for being here today. I want to turn this over to Brandon and let him talk to you about this very important issue. And when he's done, I'm going to bring it together with a communion meditation.
Okay, I have the green light, so that means my mic is working, right? Okay, thank you. Wow, thank you all so much. I have my prepared remarks, but it's on my heart to share with you all. When I walked in this morning, I just felt such love in this room. The conversations that people were having with one another on the side. Seeing Representative Hamilton, who I served on a subcommittee with 11 years ago. I just feel very moved, and I just cannot express to you all how grateful I am to be with you this morning. We are so grateful, in fact, that two of my colleagues, Angela and Vi, also with the Y, came to share this space with us today. So, in my capacity at the YW, I train on domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, batterers intervention across the state of Oklahoma. I train individuals, I train organizations, agencies, state agencies. I train in courtrooms, I train DAs. I train in conference rooms with hundreds of professionals. And when I was thinking about the deepness and the very critical nature of you all inviting us into a place of worship, the importance of that message and how I could juxtapose that with how I teach lawyers was very relevant to me. And that I wanted to be very thoughtful about the message that I shared with you all, specifically considering where we are this morning. And so I thought we would start with really redefining and looking at what domestic violence is. I'm so sorry for the loss in your family. And sometimes that's what domestic violence does look like. Sometimes it does look like brutal homicide. And unfortunately, that happens way too often in the state of Oklahoma. Any fans of Lifetime TV in here? Any Lifetime movie watchers in here? Okay. So if you were to think about what domestic violence looks like through the lens of those Lifetime movies, it's almost always some white straight lady cowering in a corner from a big mean madman, right? White, always white, straight. We see that a lot. We see the cliche of domestic violence as the woman with the big dark sunglasses and the scarf around her head, right? That it's always a victim who thinks that she deserves it for whatever reason. We have all of these different stereotypes. And not just around victims, but around perpetrators too. Typically under the costumes that I'm required to wear to be a presenter, I'd be much more comfortable in flip-flops and a t-shirt. But, we have to put this kind of stuff on. But under that, I wear a shirt that I call a tank top. When I was a kid, I called it a muscle shirt, but what do people call them these days?
Wife beaters.
Right. And we do that because of a stereotype, right? A preconceived notion that domestic violence only happens to those people, right? Not us. Not us. And sometimes when someone who isn't, one of those people is not just a victim but of abuse, but of homicide, it reminds us all, oh, right, it is all of us. Sometimes, that's what it takes for us to recognize the fact that there is no them and us with domestic violence. From the poorest and least educated to the wealthiest with 1 million letters after their name. That's all of us. within each group, we all have our own unique challenges. You know, John, I was so encouraged. Another reason why I'm just really feeling the love from you all. John said, now, when you talk this morning, you are going to include that domestic violence happens in LGBTQ plus communities, right? And I can't tell you, as a member of that community, how to hear a member of the faith community reach out in that way fills my heart up. Absolutely. And that's true. It touches all of us. Those of us in the LGBTQ plus community are not exempt. The rates of intimate partner violence are about the same. But I will tell you that in terms of vulnerability, the trans community is more victimized than any other. And in Oklahoma, unfortunately, we have a review board that's mandated by the state of Oklahoma that every time there is a homicide like this, this board looks at the situation, circumstances, and events that led up to that homicide to try and figure out where are we missing the boat? Why is Oklahoma routinely in the top 10 of states of women murdered by men in single victim, single offender homicides? Well, recently, it has gotten so bad in Oklahoma that this domestic violence fatality review board has had to create a special subcommittee to address the fact that black women are more likely to be attacked than any other racial or ethnic group. And now that body has a subcommittee specifically for black women. Another challenge in Oklahoma that we have to face. So we know that it can end in brutal violence, right? And that's the visible stuff. But again, another thing that John said, absolutely, I couldn't have said it better myself. They suffer in secret. It's behind closed doors. Even if family members and friends think, I really should say something, but what will happen to my family if I do? Will I destroy my family? Will they not talk to me anymore? And the secrets are allowed to thrive. And so I'm leaving a number of copies of some information with you all. One of it is called the Power and Control Wheel. And it sort of re-examines that idea that we have that domestic violence is only about black eyes and broken bones, that domestic violence is only about punches and kicks and you know, things you can be prosecuted for. When we really look at, some batterers, some men who batter, may only be physically violent once a year, but they maintain an atmosphere and an environment of power and control without raising a fist. And so these materials I'm going to leave you talk about a number of those tactics that even though the physical violence may only happen once a year, things like intimidation. You know, if a couple is married, they own their home together, and the perpetrator, if one of the partners is a perpetrator of domestic violence and punches a hole in the wall right next to the head of their spouse, is that a crime? You could argue that it isn't, because he didn't attack her. It's his house, it's their property. There was not domestic abuse committed. Now, you might get some officers that would interpret that law. Probably not very likely, but it could happen. Right, Angela? It could happen. Economic abuse. You know, back in the day when I first became an advocate, we would see a lot more where men would enforce their male privilege saying, I'm the man, I make the money, you're the woman, you stay home, you take care of the kids in the house, etc. Well, these days, what we see much more of is that both partners are working, just one of them will control all of the finances, so that keeping them home from not allowing them to work isn't as common as it used to be. So again, it's even harder to spot. Psychological and emotional abuse. Creating such an environment of fear and intimidation and constant and emotional abuse, and being told that you are stupid, fat, worthless, lazy, and every horrible, despicable, sexually foul, abusive, every word in the book. When you hear that stuff every day, over time, when that is exacerbated and punctuated by physical violence, that's a huge barrier to overcome. We get so frustrated with victims. Well, why don't you just leave? Well, it's not as simple as walking out the door. So I really wanted to share with you all and finish up on a couple of examples relevant to where we are this morning. And it's another one of these abusive tactics, like emotional abuse, like isolation, like intimidation, but it's called spiritual abuse. Automatically, you might assume it would be preventing someone from being part of a faith community, right? Not allowing them to attend services or go to events relevant to their spiritual community. In my career, what I've seen is far more sinister. It's actually using a victim's faith against them. Twisting scripture to justify their abuse. So I'm going to tell you the story of a couple of women I've worked with over the years, so that when you do hear somebody say, why would she stay? Let's take a second look at that before we ask that question. The first one was many years ago. It was a woman I worked with in a rural area, and she met her husband in church. Her family and her faith community were virtually the same. And in Oklahoma, that's not uncommon, right? A lot of us consider our faith communities to be extensions of our family, right? Some of us like our faith families better than we do our biological families, right? So that's not uncommon. They grew up in the same town. Families all knew each other. Everybody knows everybody. And when they started dating, he was wonderful. He was a perfect gentleman. They had the same values, the same system of faith, the same belief system, and it seemed like a match made in heaven, high school sweethearts, etc. And they got married. Everything was picture perfect. But slowly, over about the first 6 months of their marriage, he began to be violent to her. And by violent to her, I don't mean punching and kicking her. Because it rarely starts with a punch or a kick in the beginning. Because if the first date ended with a punch instead of a kiss goodnight, there wouldn't be a second date. Perpetrators don't operate that way. They show up pretending they ride in on a white horse in shining armor, looking like everything that the victim wants to be. And if there is any vulnerability that he can sense in her, he will begin planning how to exploit that. And this is, again, true for members of the LGBTQ community as well. This pattern reoccurs over and over again. And this was very true for the first woman that I worked with. So the first thing that he did to her was not shove her up against a wall or call her a really mean name. It was when they were trying to make a decision together, he said, "Oh, you don't even know what you're talking about," and just dismissed anything she had to say as if, "You're just too stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. Let me make this decision." Now, I think most of us would consider that violence, right? I think it wouldn't make a lot of us very happy if our intimate partner did something like that, but not something anyone is going to file for divorce over. The problem with perpetrators of domestic violence is it starts with questioning her validity to make decisions. Her intelligence. And so in the beginning when he would say, "Oh, you just don't know what you're talking about," over time it began to be, "You're just stupid." And then that would escalate to using words that I'm not going to use in this chapel, alongside emotional abuse, which would then escalate. And again, all of this is over time. And there are periods of, "Honey, I'm so sorry, that's not me. That's not the way I want to be. I just got frustrated. We'll go talk to the pastor. Let's go talk to the pastor. Or I'll go to counseling." Okay, all right, I'll give you another chance. Because remember, her basis for comparison is that person she fell in love with. And I keep saying she with perpetrator and he with batterer. 80% of victims of domestic violence are female. 20% are male. But that doesn't take into account the gender of the perpetrator. So that also means that though 80% of domestic violence victims are women, they have both male and female perpetrators. And the same is true for those male victims. That 20% includes female and male perpetrators. So this cycle began to go on, and after the name calling and the despicable, humiliating, degrading language that he used, he eventually shoved her. And it was like once that physical violence started, it began to, and as we know it tends to do, it will begin to intensify in frequency and severity. It will get worse and it will happen more often. That's exactly what I keep saying her. Let's call her Tammy. That's what happened to Tammy. And she didn't tell anybody. She kept it secret until the abuse got so bad that he frequently wouldn't let her go anywhere because he was afraid people were going to see what he was doing. And even missing a couple of holidays with her family, their family. So when the violence got bad enough that she had missed another holiday, and she began to really be afraid of the physical violence, that he was really going to hurt her badly, she finally reached out to her mama. And she said, "Mama, I don't know how to tell you this. I know that you think John is just the best guy in the world. Everybody loves him. But he beats me. And he hurts me really bad. And we haven't been coming to family events because I've been too beat up and he doesn't want anybody to find out." And her mama said, "Well, Tammy, you made your bed, you lay in it. We don't divorce in this family." So Tammy did not tell John that she was telling anybody, which is a good thing, because just in case you ever know anybody that's going to leave a perpetrator, do it in secret and do it safely. Don't let him or her know that they're leaving, because that is the most dangerous time for them, is if the batterer thinks that he's going to lose the victim. But Tammy didn't do that. Tammy didn't tell anybody. And so the abuse continued to escalate. Severe physical violence, hospitalization. And it finally got so bad that Tammy had to tell, because she thought, he is going to kill me. And if a victim ever tells you they're afraid that someone is going to kill them, that their perpetrator is going to kill them, please listen. Because the majority of victims, that we know this from boards like the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board, the majority of victims who were murdered by their perpetrators did not think that he was capable of doing it. So the fact that Tammy did fear that he was going to kill her was a huge red flag. So Tammy did the next best thing she knew besides her mama, and she went to her pastor. And she went to Brother Jim, and she told Brother Jim everything. And you can imagine how difficult this is. She is unmasking this man that Brother Jim thought was the epitome of a good Christian man, good values, and that's what he saw of him. And Brother Jim believed her. But he could have used some training in his approach, because what he ultimately told her after Tammy revealed the terrible physical violence, the fear, the threats that I'm going to kill you, Brother Jim said, "I am so sorry, Tammy. We have got to figure out what you're doing to make him so mad." And then he quoted her Ephesians 5. In which we all know what he probably quoted from Ephesians 5, right? But he didn't bother reading the entire scripture, because although it may refer to a wife submitting to her husband, what does it also tell us in Ephesians 5? Husbands treat their wives as Christ treats the church. Well, I don't think that anything that John was doing to Tammy was Christ-like. I can happily tell you that Tammy had done all of the hard work by the time she got to the program that I worked for. She had done it all on her own. But when she left that man, she not only had to walk away from her husband, the person that she did promise to love, cherish, trust. He broke his vows, not her. And she left. But when she left, she also had to leave her family, because they thought they sided with him and her faith community. They all thought she was wrong and that it was her fault. Another example of spiritual abuse that we've had at the YWCA, my friend Angela runs half of the programs at the YWCA. They let me run a few of them. At one point, I supervised the director of our transitional housing program. So in addition to our shelter, where typically victims and their children stay from 30 to 60 days, we also have a transitional housing program. We only have a few units, but it's for victims with greater challenges, where they can stay for up to 18 months sometimes. So we had one particular woman who was an immigrant woman, and she was brought here by a man who was an immigrant, but he was a citizen. This was in a part of Oklahoma that was again pretty rural, and he had a pretty lofty occupation in town. A lot of people knew what he did and who he was, and he brought her to this community to be a second wife. And she didn't know that was the case until she got here. and she was the only legal wife on paper. He was terribly abusive to her. He forced her to wear certain clothing. Now, she did observe hijab as an observance of her faith when she wanted to, but he also would make her wear culturally specific clothing, and she had no choice in the matter, right? In addition to what she chose to wear, in addition to the observance of hijab. And one of the things that he would often do to her, in addition to the physical abuse, was to humiliate her by making her go out and stand in the middle of the front porch, whether it was raining or whether it was 97 degrees, would just go stand out there until he told her she could come back in. Even to the point that a male neighbor had seen this a couple of times and tried to get her to come into the house with him. But this man had told her, just try and tell somebody, if you don't like the way things are run here, you're a Muslim woman in Oklahoma, they hate you. They're not going to do anything for you. And besides that, even if they didn't hate you because you're a Muslim, you're married to me and they will never believe you over me. And the only reason this woman got out was because he chose somebody else to be another model, a younger model, and signed her name to the divorce papers. And when she wouldn't leave, called law enforcement and had her removed. And then she made it through a couple of different domestic violence shelters before she finally came to stay with us. And we were in her room one day. And, you know, we take great care in our domestic violence program to honor the self-determination of the people with which we work. They've lived with someone who has threatened that self-determination, who has tried to take their ability to make their own decisions and inform their own life, their own autonomy away from them. So, you know, if we start telling them, well, you need to do this, 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 and that to make your life better, we're no better than an abuser, right? So it's incredibly important for us that we honor them where they are, we meet them where they are, not expect them to come to us. And so when we're in the apartment of a resident, and me in particular, as someone who presents as a man, knowing that many of these women have been abused by men, I'm very conscious of that. And so the director at the time, Joe, and I would go into the apartments together to talk about evaluations. Are we doing what you need? Are you getting what you need from our programs? Is there anything we can do better? And during one of these interviews, I noticed that this woman, who had lived through this horrific, humiliating abuse by this man, were talking across her coffee table. And as we're visiting, I keep noticing that she's looking at me and kind of giggling and like smiling to herself. Of course, me being self-conscious, I'm like, what have I said? I have said something inappropriate. What have I done? And I'm kind of, she does it 3 or 4 times, and I'm starting to get concerned. Like, I really must have said something, or maybe I have a booger. I don't know what's going on, right? And so I remember back to my training many years ago, when you were working with someone from a culture different than your own, and you don't understand something, what do? Ask. Ask. And I did. I said, you know, I'm afraid I may have said something. I've noticed a couple of times while we've been talking that you've kind of looked at me and given me the side eye and kind of laughed. Have I said something inappropriate? And she laughed even harder then. And she said, no, that it has nothing to do with you at all. She said, this is about me. And, you know, keep in mind, I wasn't thinking about her history of abuse and all of the things that he did to her. She said, it just came to me as we were talking that I was telling this man sitting across from me what was working for me and what wasn't working for me, what I wanted and what I didn't want, and I'm doing it in this. And she pointed down, and she was wearing some sort of a sports t-shirt, right, with some sports team on it, and windsuit pants. You know, the ones, not sweatsuit pants, but windsuit pants, right? And she said, it occurred to me that I'm here making all these decisions and telling this man, and I'm wearing what I want and sitting in my own apartment. And that little thing was such a reflection of how far she had come. Just being able to express her own opinions in her own clothing was a complete upside down and inside out version of the life of abuse that she had experienced. We still see her from time to time. She pops in for some non-residential services. But again, you know, it took her a long time to recover from the other things. And the last example I'll leave you is with another woman from a different religion. a Hindu woman from a different country, and she told me that part of the progress and the complete turnaround in her life that she experienced while receiving services from the brilliant and amazing advocates and counselors at the Y is that she told me that her faith, and by faith that was the men in her faith who told her what she was supposed to believe. As a Hindu woman, she was told by her community, not just her father, but her whole community where she came from, you as a girl have one responsibility: to make your father happy. And if it comes up, to make your brothers happy too. Until you are chosen to become a wife, and that job will be to make your husband and then your sons happy. That is your job. And then if your husband dies, you probably won't be selected to be another wife, so your job will be to continue making your sons happy. She shared with me in this definition that people who were manipulating her spiritual beliefs, there was no room for her in that identity. And this community, her family and the community surrounding him, was using her spirituality to oppress her. And so when we look at the tactic of spiritual abuse that you may encounter in the faith community, remember that none of us are immune. No religion, no spiritual path. None of us are immune. There is always a perpetrator out there willing to even manipulate something as sacred as a person's relationship with their Creator. So I've also brought some additional resources. We've got Safeline cards if you happen to know someone who needs our services, as well as a more discreet one that somebody could tuck in their shoe if they needed to hide it. And just some additional information, and I'll leave those with Brother John or Pastor John. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you. Thank you so much.